can we legally return people in the way you are suggesting without permission and consent from France?
Yes, and legally,
No,
France...
we can't.
We can, Joe.
I'm sorry.
And legally, Joe, France has a legal obligation...
Well, that's different.
Under that same international treaty...
France has not consented, and this is according to the House of Commons... Hang on. Let me finish the sentence. France has not consented to the return of vehicles to its waters. It's given a negative response to any proposals of what you call pushbacks. Without the consent of the country you'd be pushing the boats back to, the UK cannot legally adopt that policy.
So we do it, and then the French can sue us. That's how it works,
All right.
actually.
Welcome to Quiet Riot, the politics podcast that is both naughty and nice. I'm Andreou.
And I'm Naomi Smith, the vixen to Alex's Blitzen. Among the furore of festivities, we'll be publishing plenty of fun and frivolous year-end content.
A great excuse to escape the family by popping the headphones on while turkey basting. Make sure you click follow or subscribe on your podcast platform so that you never miss an episode.
And with that, pour yourself an eggnog, snuggle up on the couch and help us begin another Quiet Riot.
Hello and welcome to Quiet Riot. I'm Alex.
And I'm Naomi.
And I'm producer Kenny, back from my holidays just in time for the Christmas holidays and the New Year holidays as well.
Among Kenny's holidays, we're also going to be discussing the fast-moving events of the last few days and peppering the scares with the levity of two regular features, Wokey, Dokey and Grin and Share It.
Plus, we'll take a deep dive into the murky world of dark money and corruption in British politics. To tell us all the gory details, as well as what you can do about it, we're thrilled to welcome back to Quiet Riot investigative journalist Peter Geoghegan. Hello, Peter.
Hello, Alex. Hello, Naomi. Lovely to be back.
Peter, you've got a brilliant Substack, and we're going to leave a link to that in the show notes. But I'm really curious to know what you make of the platform and why you think it has become the go-to blogging site.
Well, it's really interesting. I set mine up about a year and a half ago, and I didn't. It was basically Twitter was turning in, really going full sewer at that point. I was leaving my old job at Open Democracy. I wanted people to come and follow me, so I just kind of set a platform just going to go, look, we'll see where this goes.
In case you mysteriously disappeared at some point.
Exactly. And so this is my last little bits of entrails. You'll find them on the Substack. You can kind of go sift through it. You'll find it, and it kind of just slowly started writing stories, and I kind of started doing what I wanted to do, what I always like doing, which is breaking stories, breaking news. I kind of thought people aren't really doing that in Substack. They're sending out their opinions, they're like writing about the day's events, but no one's actually breaking stories. And I always do. I started breaking stuff, putting up documents, saying, look, this is interesting, and it started building, and it's been amazing. We've over 16,000 people who get the weekly email. So every story is read by more than 10,000 people. Which is really, like back again when I used to run Open Democracy.
The Observer.
Well, indeed, I'd say there's definitely national titles where stories do not get 10,000 reads. And so it's what I really like about it is I like the engagement with the audience. I like the ability that people, you can play around with the format. I do a bit more too, which I like. I've started broadening it a bit. I do Q&As with authors sometimes because I'll often do, recently Miguel Delaney's got a new book about football and dirty money. That's going to be of interest to someone who's interested in our space. So do a Q&A with him. So you can play around with the format a bit, but also breaking stories. We've had, I think we're not doing badly. There's an investigation by the lobbying regulator into Peter Mandels's firm Global Counsel on the back of some of the work we've been doing on the Substack. The DUP MP, Sammy Wilson, who wouldn't answer any of our questions, apologised in Parliament last week for failing to fully declare his trips to Northern Cyprus on the back of one of our investigations. We've had a bunch of other hits where people have had to do, publish documents, do stuff. Corporates have had to. One of the most interesting ones was near the start of it, a big conference in the States that was funded by Philip Morris, the tobacco company where Tony Blair and Sadiq Khan were appearing. And I had the story and I published on the Substack. And I contacted them and, they kind of gave a mealy-mouthed response. And the Substack story went viral in the States. And they had to pull out. They kind of 24 hours later said, we're not taking any more money from Philip Morris again.
Way to go.
And so it's got that ability. The stories can travel, which I love about it.
With working in breaking news, how much planning can you do for the Substack, or is it all completely random?
We're often breaking our own stories, but not to the news agenda. So we're often doing exclusives. So it's a mix of me and my colleague Lucas, who does a lot of investigations with me. So we'd be breaking stories, but also the kind of stuff we're talking about today, like Elon Musk suggesting trying to give money to Nigel Farage. That's an area I've written about a lot. So I'll write about that kind of in real time. So it's a bit of me as well reacting to the news agenda where it's about the kind of things that we know about. And I'm always a bit like, I don't just write because something's happened, but if it's something that we care about or it's something that's like an issue that we've actually, I think, got some expertise in, then we'll write about it. More people, I think, have gone on to it in the last few months. But for me, it's less about Substack as a platform, more about emails, really. Like, I could imagine where in the world there might be a time where you go, do you know what? We'll move off Substack into another platform because it works better. But it's that email connection, I think, is fascinating. We're kind of going back. And people want to hear voices. They want to hear your voice. I write in my own voice quite a bit. And that's a bit that's fun as well. You can play a bit more at the voice. You can be a bit more irreverent. You
and
can
less
be a bit more
corporate.
yourself. Yeah.
We're going back to the fanzine.
Yeah.
Well, which is where I started.
Yeah.
My first ever publication was in St Mel's Boys' School from County Longford, where I'm from, was a fanzine, an A4 fanzine, photocopied and folded in half, mainly made up of imaginary interviews. And that was where I started off my journalism days. So we're going backwards to there.
What was the topic of the fanzine?
The topic was a mix of music and politics.
Aww.
So there's less music on Democracy for Sale on the Substack, but there's a lot more politics. And I have to say, just for that, none of the interviews are made up.
Now, rumours have been swirling that Elon Musk intends to give Nigel Farage's Reform UK party $100 million, or 80 of your £1 million, if you prefer. And Nick Candy, husband of Holly Valance, who has defected from the Tories to Reform UK, has pledged to help them raise another $40 million.
I love our country. I think our country is amazing, but our country is in decline. But I genuinely believe it's time for a change in direction, and that change in direction is Reform and Nigel Farage. I love our country. I think we have a great country, but I think our country is in serious decline. But I believe that Nigel Farage and Reform is going to be the saviour of this country. I've got friends still in the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, but I think this country needs change, and I believe the person to make that change is Nigel Farage. And I believe he'll be the next Prime Minister of this country.
You do believe that? So Farage in number 10 by 2029?
I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't 100% believe that he was going to be the next Prime Minister.
Candy's a property tycoon who used to be a big Tory donor. Then in February he praised Starmer and said it was time for a change. Now he's Reform's treasurer. This is something we see a lot with rich donors. Are they just political sluts, or just shopping around for which party will give them the most influence? Peter?
Little opener for you there.
That's the first basic question, really. Because it can't be that on a point of content or substance or policy, someone can be a Conservative, Labour and Reform in the space of 1 year. So what is this shopping around?
Stand back a bit. Look at what the job title that Nick Candy has now got at Reform, Treasurer. So if you think of, I'm sure lots of listeners are involved in organisations where there's a treasurer. I was a treasurer of a charity once. It's not much fun, really. The person who's trying to keep the books together, get the payments. It's not much crack. When it comes to political parties, particularly the Conservative Party and Reform, the job of treasurer is very different. I remember doing a story about how many treasurers from the Tory Party become Lords.
Absolutely.
You give £3 million as treasurer of the Tory Party, it's a fast track to the House of Lords. What you do as a treasurer for particularly the Tories, and now it looks like Reform, so the kind of world that Nick Candy's coming from is the treasurer isn't there to count the pennies.
It's to bring more in.
Bring more in. It's to put up a big money yourself. You have to put up first. You put up, and then you go to your mates and everybody else and say, I put in X, you put
match
in...
it.
Yeah, you match it. And that's what the job is. That's what they do. And he's seen, you look at the kind of the long list of Tory treasurers who've done that. Many have had some very controversial stories about them. Almost all of them are now sitting on the benches of the Lords and the Conservative benches of the Lords. So that's the backdrop to what Nick Candy is doing.
Elliot, I would say, is the most high-profile one of...
Elliot will be. Ben Elliot will be, and he brought... he was the guy, more than anybody else, who really started under Boris Johnson, bringing in huge sums of money. They created new... and what Reform are doing, I think, is aping the Tory strategy when it came to money. But they're going way further. So under the Tories, if you look at just a quick segue into the history of money in British politics, basically, until about 20 years ago, you had the Tories were funded by big business, etc., Labour by the unions and others. Cameron really revolutionised it. He brought in a thing called a leaders group, where you gave £50,000, and in exchange for £50,000, which is a membership fee, you had a quarterly meeting with the Prime Minister and a bunch of ministers, all off the records, very nice dinner, which frankly for 50 grand is, that's pretty good access. Under Elliott and Johnson, they upped the ante. They created a thing called the Advisory Board, which sounds like, they've all got these ridiculous names as well. And that was 250,000, so $250,000. So you've got...
And do they have any legal standing? Are they like unincorporated associations, or are they just a name? It's an email list.
It's an email list with and this is problematic for transparency, there's no meeting records kept, there's no notes kept of who attended. The Conservatives for a few years used to publish at least lists of attendees. They stopped doing that about 5 or 6 years ago. But now what Reform are doing, I think, is upping the ante even more. The last few years we've seen, like in 2023, 2/3 of all the money raised in British politics came from just 19 people who all gave over £1 million. It's a big difference. Frank Hester, the pretty disgraced health tech tycoon, he gave 1/8 of all the money that went into British politics last year. So what you're seeing, I think, with Reform is they're continuing that trend and going even further. So Candy's talking about 3 million. He's talking about raising 40 million in total. These are huge sums in the history of British politics. And what's Candy doing? In some ways, like, he's probably reading some of the runes. He's probably looking at polls. He's probably looking at where influence is as well. Because we can see that people who have positions like treasurers, people who give big money to parties, get influence. And where, if you were looking to get influence with an up-and-coming organisation, frankly, Reform is the place to go. They're going to want people like him.
He's getting in on the ground level, basically. He's seeing it as an enterprise.
Well, look at Elon Musk in America. We'll talk about Musk and Farage in a bit, but look what Elon Musk did for Trump. And he's now, his fortune has absolutely mushroomed way beyond the couple of $100 million he spent on donating to Trump and on giving away that lottery on X.
Ostensibly buying Twitter was also part of that, because he lost a lot of money.
Lost leader strategy.
Completely. He's made that money back.
Gave him, exactly.
It's given him all of that. And I think a lot of people, I would include myself, misunderstood what was happening there. I was probably one of those people going, he doesn't look, he's wasting all the value. People like me, like people like all of us we're going to blue sky. He doesn't care about that. The big play is way bigger. Like SpaceX today is valued at 350 billion, but a new valuation are buying back shares. But this is a long-winded way of saying what this is about is people like Nick Candy and others being in those rooms. He would have been in the leaders group of Tory donors. So Nick Candy knows a lot about how party funding works. He's seen it. He will have been glad-handed. He has given money. He's given a lot of money to Tories. So he knows how that scene works. But what's really striking is he's getting in on the ground floor of Reform, and he's massively upping the ante. Instead of asking for your 50,000s, even your 250,000s, they're going to be asking for millions. And they can point to someone like Musk and say, look at the influence you can have if you get in here early. And what you see with Trump is a lot of people never gave money to Trump, and they're going to lose out now, frankly. You can see. And people are going to go, actually, I want to get in there, because it's
but
not
the price is double.
But the price is still low, not even just compared to the States, but compared to lots of other things. These are not, if you are a billionaire, a couple of £1 million, it's actually a punt worth taking. So that's the context which when I would see Nick Candy, and it's part of the wider Reform. It's really striking how post-election Reform have mutated. Gowan Towler, he was long UKIP Brexit Party press officer, he's gone. They're clearly cleaning shop. They're clearly trying to professionalise a lot, and they're trying to bring people in who've got links way beyond the kind of Brexity world of the Aaron Bankses of this world who bankrolled the Brexit campaign.
Who will command big salaries that need to be paid for by donors giving big money. Back to the political sluts point, Alex. I don't for a second believe Nick Candy was ever Labour curious. I think these are smart guys that know, step one, we've got to get rid of the Tories. And at that moment, Farage hadn't re-entered the fray. And, I don't know if he's part of the people that were egging Farage on to stand again, whether he even needed it. But if you rewind well over a year ago, his wife, Holly Valance, was already attending Reform UK events, was already doing media interviews talking about how both Australia and the UK had lost their way.
She was also attending popcorn events, though.
But what I mean is I don't think they're political sluts. I think they are hard right libertarians who were never really going to make a home in Labour at all. It was a expeditious move. Right, if I can be seen to be doing anything at all to help Labour win, to get the Tories out, then I can queue up for Reform the next time. They could never have won it in this election.
What's really striking as well is it's really bad news for the Conservatives in particular. You are seeing one of their big donors. The Tories, the extent to which money fled the Tory party in the 2024 general election is unbelievable. Yeah. If you strip out Frank Hester, so in the run-up, in the kind of short campaign, the 6 weeks up to 2019, the Tories under Boris Johnson raised about £40 million, a huge amount of money, a record sum for British politics. Fast forward to 2023, especially on the back of Hester's money, Sunak actually raises the spending thresholds very significantly for general elections and also raises the anonymity threshold as well, so it's hard to know who's giving money. Come election time, all the donors flee. The Tory party raised a tenth of what they raised in 2019 in the 2024 general election campaign. And it was really striking. It was like old school Tory donors who are now in the Lords who were giving like 25 and 50 grand just because you'd imagine they felt like they should. But that was it. There was no big money. There was nobody coming in the door. The likes of Nick Candy kept their hands in their pockets. They didn't give to Labour.
You also follow not just money going directly into the coffers of the political parties, but into the wider ecosystem, for want of a much better word, that surrounds them. And we often hear the phrase Tufton Street or 55 Tufton Street. How much money flowed into those kinds of organisations? Did they see a bit of a decline in donations as well as the Tories in the run-up to the last election, or have they maintained quite healthy levels?
It's quite hard, yes. So Tufton Street basically is that network of libertarian or right-wing think tanks who they're all around central London, not just Tufton Street, but some of the streets awful. But Tufton Street, I always think it's a useful shorthand. We're talking about the Institute of Economic Affairs, people like the Adam Smith Institute, the Centre for Policy Studies. Yeah, there's lots of them. And there's like this one building, 55 Tufton Street, in which there's so many of them. You're like, it's like a TARDIS. You're like, how could all these organisations be in there? And then you realise actually some of these are very small and often it's the same carousel of people that revolve around them. A lot of them are kind of quite astroturfy. Because they do not declare their donors. So that's why people, like I would call them dark money, don't declare their donors. And ironically, often the only source of information we can get, and I spend a lot of time looking at it, is actually US corporate filings, because you can see people in the US giving them money, which they can then spend. So I've looked at that, and you can see they often get money from the kind of people who fund, climate denial in the States. I did a story just before the presidential election in the US looking at how much money donors who had donated to Tufton Street had also donated to the Trump campaign. So that's the world that they're in. What's striking about them is they get so much bang for their buck, these think tanks. It's incredible. They've never actually had that much money. We don't know about their finances at the moment because they file accounts annually and their next accounts probably won't be due for a while. I did a story on the IEAs when they came out. The last ones came out about this time last year, and they'd had 4,500 media hits in the previous year, which is just unbelievable. They've been on the radio, something like TV, radio, print, something like 12 times
and
a day.
these are the people who basically wrote Liz Truss's agenda for her that failed so spectacularly. So these people just fail up.
You may know the answer to this. I know that political donations are not tax deductible in this country if you're an individual. But is it the case that if you've got a company, the company can make political donations and that is tax efficient? And in other words, taxpayers are ponying up for a lot of this?
Well, not only that, these think tanks, almost all of them are charities, which is quite remarkable if you think about it. The IEA is a charity, which is very much the organisation that, in Tim Montgomery's words, incubated Liz Truss, which I don't think he meant it in quite the way it now sounds. When I was writing my book, also called Democracy for Sale, a few years ago, I interviewed Gutto Bebb, who was a Welsh Conservative minister, and he said to me, he's like, look, if I wanted to influence politics and I had £250,000, I wouldn't give it to a party, I'd give it to a think tank. If Elon Musk was to donate to Nigel Farage, he could in theory do it through the British branch of X. That would actually be theoretically a crime, would be a breach of electoral law, but that would never be prosecuted. That would actually happen fine. But what's interesting about the reasons companies can donate is because back in the day when, before the last 20 years, the Tory party really relied on money from big companies. Yeah. And so this was all, we had no donation, we had no disclosures of donations. Lord McAlpine in the 80s, the late Lord McAlpine used to wander around the city of London with a big bag of cash to filled with cash from donors at Christmas time. That's how they funded the party. And big companies gave money. So when they wrote the electoral laws, they said companies can donate. As soon as a couple of cycles of donations and disclosures, companies could see their names all over the paper and they didn't like it, so they stopped donating. Yeah. But they continued to donate to things like APPGs and think tanks, which people don't look at. And you can have influence in those spaces. So that's what you can see. You can see big corporations starting to donate to people like that. BP have donated to the IA for years. British American Tobacco still donate to the IA. And at the same time, what then happened was basically front companies started donating to politics. So I've written about this so often. Companies that aren't doing business in the UK donating to politics. They're just a shell company. You can set up a shell company in about 15 minutes on the internet.
Can I ask a slightly challenging question then? Because I see a lot of people very worried about the Musk thing, expending a lot of energy online saying we have to tighten up donation laws, we have to give the Electoral Commission proper teeth. I worry that if someone as rich as Musk wants to funnel 100 million into British politics, there is no legislation you can put in place that will stop it. A way will be found.
I think it's a challenge. I think with something like Musk, I think is a different order to a lot of other stuff. There's two things happening. One, I think most people are really surprised when they find out you can give unlimited amounts of money to politics. I think that's something that does surprise people. You go, what? You can give as much money as you want and you can. That's fine. People, I think, would also be surprised that there's very little regulation on party spending outside of a general election campaign. So say the next 3 years, someone like Reform can basically spend any money that comes in the door, you can spend it and really you can't see it. They're under very little obligation to show it, whoever you are. One of the reasons why there's so much money in the States is because under the Constitution, the Supreme Court decided in 2012, the Citizens United decision, that political speech was free speech and political donations were a form of free speech. We don't have that in the UK. You can legislate around some of this stuff. So there is some stuff that would make it harder for sure. The one thing we can't do, especially as a single country, is do anything about Elon Musk on Twitter. Yeah. So that's the bit, I think, which is different. That's a different box, if that makes sense. So there's a box around using money to actually do stuff. There's a box around using money to hire staff, etc. I think there's stuff that you can do legally around that. What you can't do much about is Elon Musk pushing agendas on social media. The challenge now is because we have a public sphere that's privatised. Yeah. Our public sphere is completely privatised, really, and becoming more privatised. Where people get their information in the run-up to polling day is changing. It's changing really quickly. It's gone from places like the BBC and broadcasters. We always had a privatised print media, but pretty public broadcast. We still have a pretty public broadcast, but most people are getting their information on social media, which looks super public. Like if you were to describe it to someone, like, no, this is egalitarian. It's all of these people saying their views.
It really isn't.
No, it really isn't.
Yeah,
no.
It really isn't.
And it's a privatised space owned by very rich people who are now massively emboldened.
But this year, the Ofcom report just a month ago said that for the first time ever in Britain this year, more people were using social media as the primary source for their news content than were using television and traditional broadcast sources. So it's not just that they've moved in and taken over a big section, they've taken over the big section.
To what extent are donors still giving cash for gongs and meaningless baubles like knighthoods, but much more meaningful accolades as being a legislator, to what you talked about at the top of the show, which is just buying access, agenda setting, the wider fiscal framework that a government might pursue rather than a peerage?
It's a really interesting thing for someone like me who looks at this work. Why are people giving money to politics? What is it? Some people have genuine political beliefs. That motivates some people. Some people want, and we saw this, I think, particularly with the Conservative Party in the last few years when they almost basically ran out of legitimate donors and ended up with people like Mohammed Mansour, a former minister in Hosni Mubarak's government, as their co-treasurer. There's people who want to reputation launder. They want to gain access into British society, and that's part of why they're giving money. And that was a big part for the Tories. The access piece, I think, is really, really interesting because what we're seeing, I think, and I wonder about the Nick Candy stuff kind of speaks to this, is it feels like we're moving away from people who want access to influence, say, this specific piece of legislation. I want this specific piece of legislation changed because it means something for my company.
Which is quite American.
Very American, yeah, very American. They're lobbying around that. And that's what a lot of lobbyists are doing, trying to change.
Please put tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles because I own Tesla.
Exactly. And lo and behold, it makes a big difference for me. And these two things can happen simultaneously. You can want that, but also wanting to change the agenda setting. And that's what's fascinating. It's one of the reasons I got so interested in the think tanks world, because some of the work that they were doing was lobbying around specific things that you could see, okay, your donors will have an interest in this, but it's also about changing the entire landscape. The Musk donation speaks to that, or the proposed Musk donation, and even the involvement of people interested less in things like knighthoods. I think that's quite possible. They're less interested in wanting to sit in the Lords and more in actually changing who's in the government. And actually, that's where the big money is to be made. Look at Musk. It's access to the state. And if you can get in on the ground floor at that, you are, like, Musk is showing this new world of access capitalism that goes beyond just being able to influence some laws around you.
Yeah, no, you buy governments.
Effectively.
He's buying governments. I have two more short, challenging threads. Why should I worry about Musk? Why shouldn't I worry about some really rich British dude giving Dyson deciding to give 100 million to reform? That never made sense to me. What is it that makes the notion of foreign interference somehow more corrosive? I never got that.
I would very much echo that. I found the foreign interference of outside of stuff like, say, the Russian state or the Chinese state which I think is different.
Yeah,
they're different, and what they do is different. But in terms of individuals, no, I would take a similar position. When they wrote electoral laws, they did decide that's what they wanted to do. So Britain did decide they didn't want people who weren't either on the electoral roll in the UK or British citizens to be able to do it. But I agree. We should be just as concerned, and we should be just concerned about what we can see as the recent history. Look at just the PPE scandal. The COVID VIP lane, which is for basically a lane for people who are politically connected. If you were in that, you were 10 times more likely to get one of these huge government contracts. Billions of pounds worth of that PPE was worthless and useless and has never worked. That's the kind of access. They were life-changing amounts of money. What I feel like, looking at the Musk donation story followed up by the Candy story, I don't know if this is intentional, but in some ways the Musk story did actually really set the groundwork for what is in some ways much more worrying, I think, in terms of what might be happening on the ground right now, which is serious big money coming in because we have unlimited donations. I think really we should be worried about any one individual who's able to have that much influence. Whether they're sitting in California or sitting in, Colchester is neither here nor there.
My last challenge is, does it matter anyway? The Democrats outraised and outspent the Republicans in the States by almost 100%. They still lost.
Yeah, and I think this is why someone like me, who comes out from a kind of investigative journalist position, is less interested in the party political outcomes on this issue. What I do think matters about this, if you look at some of the focus groups, people talking Democratic voters, people hated the fact that Democrats were in bed with big money. They hated it. They knew it and they hated it. It actually fed directly into the kind of attack lines that Donald Trump could use. It was very effective.
Now Trump's not even taking his presidential salary again.
I mean, I'm old enough to remember that Jimmy Carter having to fucking sell the peanut farm, and now Trump is going out hawking perfume for Christmas, and his wife is selling patriotic Christmas baubles, and no one is batting an eyelid. I mean, they are directly using their platform to sell tat.
It's not the only reason why we've seen a rise of populism. It's not the only reason why we've seen people becoming disgruntled with politics. But people ordinary voters do not like the role that money has in our politics. And I think it's something that the Labour Party so far don't seem to fully grasp. They think that people think of Tory sleaze. They don't think of Tory sleaze. They just think of sleaze. And I think this is a thing. Unless you take that out, it's actually much easier for the likes of Trump, who are basically saying to you, the game is rigged, and I'm going to reward the people who give me money because I'm being honest with you. That's effectively what he's saying. He's saying, and he goes, and everyone, and all you have to do is look up the SEC and look at all that money that them raise.
Classic cartoon with a sheep in the field and the wolf going, "I will eat you," and the sheep are going, "Well, at least he says it like it is."
And if you don't do something to take that out, if you decide we're going to keep a system where you have unlimited amounts of money you can give, where only 4% of lobbying is registered, where people have a revolving door between going into politics and then big jobs in private sector afterwards, and which you will have both Labour and the Tories. And, it was blindingly obvious that this would become an issue for Labour as soon as they're in power.
And the Lib Dems, Nick Clegg's at Meta.
There's all of that stuff. It doesn't really matter what your party is. And that's the bit where I do think this issue actually speaks to some of the underlying problems that people have with our politics. And the fact that the Dems outspent, it shows how trying to think, which I think there's definitely people in Labour at the moment, that, we can get more money than the other guys, so it's actually good for us, is the wrong approach and the wrong attitude.
And it sounds like you think it'd be more fruitful to regulate the output rather than the input. Not that the input should be left unregulated. basically what parties spend money on is much easier to say we want to see where every single penny
I
goes.
think you do the two, frankly. I think you do both sides of it. We didn't need that much money in politics a few years ago. Like, this is a new thing. The scale of it's just gone up off the roof.
But it's just with AI and access to those kinds of systems, you would just see random PayPal accounts sending a £5 each to Reform until they had magically reached 80 million quid. That's my worry. And then they would turn around and make a virtue out of it and say all our donations are small donations.
You can investigate this stuff, though. I think safeguarding our democracy actually is not in anybody's remit. It's not in so the National Crime Agency, amazingly, they will do big investigations into money laundering. They do big investigations into basically politically exposed people, but they will never look at a political donation, which is unbelievable. So you get people who have a rap sheet about corruption as long as your arm, or at least allegations, very serious allegations, who can then just give money to parties, which again, I think you're like, is this okay? And no one actually investigates that. All the parties have to do basically is check, is this person on the electoral roll? And that's it.
Peter, quite right, we love to give people a call to action. They already know about your Substack. We will leave links to that in the show notes for sure. But you're also running a survey. Is that something you'd like people to complete, and how can they do it?
Yes, please do. It's Safeguarding Democracy Survey. It's asking loads of questions, very similar to questions Alex is asking me too, which is great. Basically, we're trying to get enough evidence together to try and ask people, what do people think about this? What are their views on this issue? So you can find it on it'll be pinned on my Blue Sky.
We'll leave a link.
It's on the internet.
Quiet riot.
It's now time for our regular feature, Wokey Dokey. Alex, the anti-wokers have drawn inspiration from, of all places, India. Can you tell us more?
I don't know that this is a very confusing story, and I wanted to share it with you as much for clarification as anything else. So this isn't a woke thing, this is an anti-woke thing. Okay. Arabella Byrne,
good name,
like
strong,
Toryest name ever in The Spectator, is investigating why apparently so many men are wearing Nehru jackets. Wokey dokey dokey dokey. Wokey dokey.
What? In the Cotswolds?
Yeah, apparently. Well, I mean,
Because it's cold?
I guess that's where she is, so that's where she's noticed it. That is just one of the many, many gaps in this story.
Wax jacket and hunter wellies. That's not the uniform.
I have to tell you, it's basically begins with her, first of all, being at a dinner party and noticing that a couple of people were wearing Nehru jackets.
Uh-huh.
And then asking the fashion editor at The Spectator whether it's a fashion thing, and the fashion editor saying, yeah, they're kind of really in at the moment. But then deciding there was something more going on because obviously there is a colonial echo to Nehru jackets. And so she kind of jumps several syllogistical steps and arrives at the conclusion, my best guess
Always a good start.
is that the Nehru has become part of a wider anti-woke narrative that takes against the frenzied hand-wringing of institutions like the National Trust.
Oh, my God.
And I was reading this and I was like, where did that come from? They're a symbol of unapologetic affluence. The Nehru is therefore a defiant take-up of Raj. Jewel in the crown style, a tacit, if very polite, fingers up to the concept of cultural appropriation in a post-colonial world.
But Nehru was an anti-colonialist.
I know, it left me reeling, the logic of this. I mean,
He was irreligious. He was a social democrat.
Yeah, but none of those are the defining characteristics as far as Arabella is concerned. The defining characteristic is that he was foreign and brown, innit? Therefore, wearing a fashion item that he established, which as far as I know, has been in vogue at least twice in my lifetime. Apparently, it's a finger up to the National Trust.
Was Nehru not a fan of the National Trust? No. Nehru didn't like the National Trust.
No, I think it's because the idea is the National Trust would frown at the cultural appropriation of wearing dress that is vaguely, according to Arabella's best guess. That is the logic here. It's
incredible.
I can see in your faces that you're not fully with Arabella on this.
I think we need to start a new regular feature called Arabella's Best Guess. Phenomenal.
I thought you were going to say Arabella's fashion corner. Hoop earrings. What do they really mean?
Well, thank you, Alex. Listeners, if you come across any cases of woke, do send them in to quietriotpod@gmail.com. Quiet Riot. Short of doing 24-hour rolling podcasting, we simply cannot cover everything that happens expectedly in the world of politics, let alone the unexpected. Since our last show, the most surprising moment, of course, has been the fall of the Assad regime in Syria. It remains very uncertain as to what is going to happen in the country, but there is little question that after more than 2 decades of Assad's rule, preceded by 30 years under his comparably brutal father, has been hellish for the Syrian people. No crime has been too heinous for the Assads as they did whatever it took to retain power. Few governments worldwide have been as ruthless, but that topic deserves a dedicated show with a foreign policy expert. So, listeners, keep your ears open for a Quiet Riot show with Arthur Snell coming soon. At home, domestic battles continue over everything from spending reviews to planning reform, public sector pay rises, inheritance tax on farmers, and the never-ending will they, won't they, over a youth mobility scheme with the EU, immigration, prison reform, the committee stage of the assisted dying bill, booting out the hereditaries from the Lords, and more. So what on earth to focus on to do any of them justice? Alex, there's a real money thread running through these themes, or many of these themes anyway.
In that there isn't any.
Well, indeed. Most obviously, the spending reforms and public sector pay rises. Is there any light at the end of the pain tunnel for Labour?
Maybe, maybe not. I mean, look, at least there is a departmental review happening, like across Whitehall. There hasn't been one, I think, since 2017, which is just weird.
Yep.
To not review your expenditure and what department gets what and what they do with it. I mean, it's crazy. So I think that's a positive thing. I know Labour have been criticised for the number of reviews and consultations, and I think that's crazy in my view. The idea that it's much better to just
squirrel away in a dark room and come out with the...
Put your finger up in the air and come up with a policy and then announce it and then not do it, which has been the pattern in the last few years rather than consultant stuff, I think is quite crazy. I think they're doing the right thing on those two, but at the same time, you create a situation where there's a lot of departments that are going to be unhappy about stuff, briefing against other departments. Ministers are going to be annoyed if their portfolio shrinks. So you create a politically fraught situation. At the same time, you have a voting public that seems to want everything sorted yesterday. And I understand that frustration and that impatience, but it's simply an unrealistic expectation. And so I think basically Labour are in for a couple of years of real pain. And the only thing that might relieve it at the tail end of that period is if people actively start seeing a difference in their lives, start seeing a difference in public services. And so, I mean, in many ways, they just have to
ride it out,
find the best ways of communicating what they're doing, which they haven't, and find the best ways of absorbing the criticism, which they haven't, find the best people to be putting forward, to be talking to media, traditional and non-traditional, all the time, which they haven't, and hope that their plan is basically a good one.
They do get rewarded.
And they get rewarded.
So on the comms front, the NIMBYs are losing their minds over Rayner's planning reforms, but we desperately need new homes, both in terms of supply and quality, and they've got to go somewhere. And Alex, a couple of times now, since the farmer protests kicked off, you've talked about the mishandling of the inheritance tax change. It shouldn't have been in the budget, you say. It should have been wrapped up in a great big suite of here's what Agri is going to get from us. And by the way, we're going to have to do this to balance the books, but you're getting all of this other stuff too. So is there something similar Rayner could and should be doing on housing? Like, yes, we'll build on your green belt, but only on brownfield sites. And we're going to add a minimum of 2 new GP surgeries and 1 extra school per X number of houses that get built somewhere. Like, what can she do to avoid Reeves's mistake with Agri?
Considering the target they've set for themselves on housing, not very much, I'm afraid, which is a problem because they can't afford to basically lose a year. If the target had been a little bit, not more realistic, so they could have said that we will aim to be building X number of houses by year 5. That would have given someone like Rayner the time to choose a couple of places to use as
hero projects. Yeah.
And say, this is the sort of greenbelt land that's not really greenbelt that we'll be using. And that's what it looks at the other end with a new GP practice and new shops and, and then the rest of the country can go, we want a bit of that. But considering they've set themselves this target, the only way of achieving that is to go basically, suck it up, we're building houses in your constituency. But, if there is a fundamental dishonesty there, there was a really good bit in Politics Live on Wednesday where Ava Santina Evans, there was a Tory MP there complaining about, prison places, like they had nothing to do with it.
Well, may I just ask, so you accept that we do need to build more prisons, we need more prison space, and we need longer and tougher sentences, correct?
Conservatives
Is that correct, though? No, but Labour should build.
I'm answering the question. Conservatives have said that if prisons are in our strategic national interest, then we support the building of them.
Fantastic. So will you now pledge that you will have a prison in your constituency?
Labour have to own the decisions that they're taking. It's a non-point.
Then went into doublespeak. And that's the basic issue.
Peter, I'm told that over on the hell site that is now x.com, Reform is already running ads saying that Labour's newly built homes will mostly be occupied by immigrants. And meanwhile, the entire ding-dong at PMQs today between Starmer and Badenoch was over immigration. It's gone up under you. No, it went up under you. And repeat and repeat. Does Farage even need to be Prime Minister when so much political discourse is just on his agenda anyway?
It does feel like the Labour Party have decided that they want that the issues of reforms issues are the issues that they need to be, that's where they need to be at the moment. And I guess there's 2 ways of listening to that. I found it quite dispiriting listening to Starmer talking about the Tories as the party of open borders, etc., etc. Because it really does frame it, because very few people are going to believe that Labour are going to be the party of not open borders.
Exactly.
That's not where people are at. But by the same, I feel like Labour are doing a pretty dangerous game, because what it looks like they're trying to do is basically discredit the Tories so badly that voters won't go back to the Tories, and that's the general strategy. You can see where they're doing it. They're trying to bury the Tories.
So let's talk about immigration. He has relaunched yet again. Many new targets, 6 more milestones, 5 missions, but why was cutting immigration not a priority?
Because the previous government presided over record high levels of immigration. The figures just a few weeks ago, nearly 1 million on net migration. That is unprecedented. A one-nation experiment in open borders under the last government. And she was the champion. She stood up and praised the then Tory Home Secretary for listening to her on removing caps on migration visas. So she was applauding it. Now she's furious.
And the hope then is that the right-wing vote stays split. It's some of it sucks off to reform and the Tories become a rump and aren't able to. The danger is that the Tories go into a death spiral. Badenoch, I cannot get over how little I ever even hear her name. Like, I'd say her name recognition amongst the public. It's just, she's not, it reeks. Scottish Labour went through this. I reported on Scottish politics for a long time where they went through a lot of leaders very quickly after the referendum. And it was just because one person did one good interview, next thing you know, they're the leader. And the public very quickly lost any kind of lost any kind of sense with them. And I think that's what Labour are trying to do in immigration, and they're trying to say, look, we're listening to, etc. The danger is that they are fighting these things on Nigel Farage's territory, and that by having that conversation in the way they're having it, that Nigel Farage becomes, well, actually, do you know what? Reform are the only party. And migration, I think, unlike housing, is one of those things that actually people don't see. Like, if you were to ask the members of the general public, how many people do you think come across on small boats? I'd say most people would say millions. The reality is tens of thousands. Like, people, it's unlike houses. Houses are fixed things. You can see the house. You can have a picture of the house. You can go and video the house.
But that's not how culture wars work. And, most people probably don't know a trans person. But yet you all need to be terrified of trans people using your bathroom.
Exactly. And I think that's the bit where, especially on immigration, Labour, it's like, at one level, they're going to have a positive narrative in a few years' time anyway, because migration is going to go down.
Yeah,
there was we brought all these new statistics.
Especially next year.
Completely. Migration is only going one way and it's down. And there's a whole load of reasons. There was bizarre decisions made around who would count as migrants, bringing students into figures. All this stuff the Tories did, which frankly, on their own terms, were crazy. It did not help the Tories at all. That's what I think Labour are effectively doing. But I think it's quite a risky strategy. I think it could end up that we end up talking about an issue like migration where there isn't really, like, it's actually a valence issue. It's not an issue of numbers. It's an issue of people's attitudes. It's an issue of people's personalities. Like, it's the new social cleavage that we're seeing around, in terms of where politics are breaking down. Which is what Reform are doing,
right? They're like, okay, maybe you're not afraid of immigrants, but you are afraid of the fact that your house is riddled with damp. So I'm now going to tell you that, don't support them for building all these new homes because you're not going to get them anyway. It is just populism. And I think you're right about Labour pandering to the wrong thing here, because there was a very interesting YouGov poll out this week looking at the favoured ideologies of different voter types. And environmentalism is top 3 for every voter group bar Reform. Right, 64% favourable view of environmentalism as an ideology, 56% feminism, 41% liberalism, 38% socialism. You then got only 30% backing capitalism, 29% nationalism, and only 24% libertarianism.
And 2% fascism.
Right, but almost every
2% of people went, quite like fascism.
Bit of fash, bit of Mussolini. But yet, almost every news story, every radio show, or dare I say it, even every political podcast bar, really great ones, would have you believe that the list is inverted, that it's the other way around, that it's 64% of people who really care about libertarian, conservative, nationalist values. So, Peter, like we touched on this earlier, but does this tell us something about media ownership and the interests of those who control the media, not just those who are buying influence over the body politic?
I think, and this is one of the things I think Labour, you talked about earlier about comms, Alex, and I think it's been a big issue for Labour. And it still feels to me like Labour are trying to engage with the media, with the print media in particular of 1997, not the print media of 2024.
And as the opposition.
And as the opposition, yeah. And in 1997, even the Telegraph, the Times sold a lot more. Your average Times reader was much more in the middle of the political spectrum. Yeah. As time has gone on, these are self-selecting groups who are, and the Telegraph is completely off the deep end, frankly. Like, some of the stuff in the Telegraph's opinion pages is genuinely howling at the moon. And that's partly a function of it's a function of changes in the way media works. It's a function of people buying newspapers. And it's a function of these media organisations acting as very small nodes for very particular viewpoints.
Okay, so I have a story here that really, and I know the vibe of the show is breathe, and I will try not to get incredibly fucking annoyed. But this is a story from the BBC news website. Okay, it was the second top headline of their politics section. It's not a random day, it's a day when Labour are firefighting about the departmental review and the offer of 2.8% to civil servant, which incidentally is being misreported. It is just the government's representation to the pay review board. The unions will then make their representations. The review board will make a decision. So on that day, two journalists, Brian Wheeler, BBC Politics, and Matthew Cole, the senior political reporter, decide to report on a story. Government department spends 1,200 on 2 folders. That's the title. And it's only if you read like 7 paragraphs into it that you realize that those are the Queen's manufacturers that make basically the leather boxes and the ministerial portfolio that basically they're only 1 per department and they last 25 years. You only replace them very occasionally.
So cost per use, pence.
Yeah. And 2 of them came up, and that's how it's always been, and those are the prices. And maybe there's a conversation to be had, you shouldn't be spending that on those folders. But there's been no interest in this for the last, I don't know how many fucking decades. So don't tell me that it's a coincidence that 2 senior BBC political journalists decide on the day of the departmental spending reviews to report as if they're 2 fucking arch-lever binders that Lisa Nandy decided to buy for 600 quid each. And that's not the story at all. No. So the entire landscape is rotten and toxic, I'm afraid. And the BBC, whom I have defended for 2 decades now, are very much a part of that now. And I just don't know what you do with it. I get what you're saying about immigration. Labour did a press conference last week explaining their priorities and their milestones and how they were going. And they didn't mention immigration. And what were the headlines? And every question they were asked in the Q&A afterwards, isn't immigration a priority? Why aren't you mentioning immigration? There is no room to manoeuvre through this.
But you can answer with being more pro-immigration than they do.
Look, that is an answer.
And we do, and you're an immigrant. And I feel that it must be horrendous to live in this country, and every time you turn on the TV, every time you're looking at the front pages, you will not be able to avoid an anti-immigrant bashing. It's horrendous, and we need leaders that are prepared to stand up against that narrative.
Look, it is horrendous, but also I don't think it's anti-immigration to say that you can't go into election after election promising X, Y, Z and then delivering the opposite. It's corrosive. And I think that is Labour's main point. I don't know that Labour kind of major on the idea that immigrants are bad for the country. I think they major on the idea that you can't say we're going to cut immigration and then triple it. And you can't say that Brexit will bring us control of the border and then it triples. People aren't listening anymore. And the only way I think they will listen is if they begin to trust the party again a tiny bit. And I think what Labour see is precisely that, because immigration is due to come down anyway, that gives them that little opening to say, look, we're the first people that did this for you. Whether it's right or wrong, whether it's the morally correct thing to do or not, that's the wider picture, I would say.
And one little bit of bad news, though. If they do that, they keep immigration right at the top of the news list. And that, ultimately, is Farage's biggest victory.
To kind of hold up for some of my own colleagues journalistically, I think they're in a bit of a bind just because we've got very set. It feels like since 2016, since June of 2016, since the Brexit referendum and then Trump and the Tories, we've got very set ideas about who quote-unquote, the voters are and what they care about. And they're quite monolithic. And we're quite monolithic about why one party is successful and why, what's driving, say, support for X, Y, and Z. I think we're quite monolithic in the ideas behind why that is. Is migration part of the messaging that Trump won on? 1,000%. A really extreme version of migration, for sure, on immigration, deporting tens of millions of people. Similarly, is reform going to push a really hard line on migration? For sure. But the extent to which their cause and effect is actually still to be determined. There's lots of other reasons why people vote for Trump. There's lots of reasons why people vote for reform. And I think there's a way, there's a bit of the sociological thing, and especially if you're say you're a journalist in the lobby, you're not spending that much time on Watford High Street trying to hearing the other things that people we can see it from polling around public services. Actually, that's been a big thing. One of the big reasons, and those two issues are getting tied together. People say there's more people here. That's why public services are down, as opposed to the reality, which has been way less money going to public services. So there's a lot of other things where I think it's become a shorthand. That's why I think journalists go back again and again to it.
It's bad governance is what it is. Where jobs are going to be is one of the most predictable metrics and one of the most reliable levers that government can pull. If X amount of jobs are going to appear in that location, you're going to need the equivalent supporting infrastructure. But they don't fucking do it. So what does it matter?
And no government has. Yeah. The last Labour government definitely didn't do that.
Yeah. So what does it matter if it's people moving from Scotland and Liverpool and Birmingham because that factory just opened? They're still not going to be able to get GP appointment unless you go, if there's going to be 10,000 extra people here,
we should manage population.
We should put a couple of GPs.
Which was the story of Springfield, Ohio, where Trump was talking about the Haitian eating dogs. But actually, that story became a useful story for the Republicans because it flagged exactly that. And the problem was a huge amount of immigration. People couldn't get GPs appointment. And people were really angry because the Haitians were getting up at 6 a.m. to go and queue. They were doing stuff that we wouldn't, frankly, people who were living in the place wouldn't do. Because that's
planning.
It's called planning, and there was none of that. And so I think that's exactly, and that feeds into that cycle again.
Call to action to round off this section. Alex, I think you were looking for a consultation that people...
I have a couple of things, actually. I mean, the first, because I know you do it often enough, but I really must invite people to give to Best for Britain if they can. We were just exploring the money landscape, okay?
And Peter said if you want to have influence, give money to a think tank.
But there's more and more...
Peter quoted someone saying that, just FYI.
It's just a really bizarre phenomenon that when the right wing are in power, they up the money they give to those kinds of organizations. And when the left is in power, they suddenly stop. Actually, that's when you need to maintain your civic society. That's when you need the policy ideas. That's when you need them to be doing the background work, the polling. And so I would encourage you to go, we'll drop a link. Are you still doing the tree thing?
We are still doing the tree thing.
I will drop a link to the tree thing because if you donate £10, not only are you helping some very, very good work, but you're also helping plant a tree. And then the other one I have is, I'm a big fan of consultations. The amount of energy and rage people waste online talking about the stuff they don't like. When if you go right now to the government site...
There's 11 pages.
Consultation. It's impossible you not find stuff that interests you and that you have a view on. But the one I wanted to pull out was a consultation on reforming the right to buy. I cannot say how important this is on the housing crisis. I think Labour are leaning in the direction of the stock that's sold needing to be replaced. And so I think if you go there and comment on the consultation, you are giving the government the muscle, the oomph, the public support to do what they should do and want to do anyway. So I would encourage you to do that, and I will drop a link for that.
Quiet, riot.
But now it's time for lighter news. Because it's time to, and I am aware I've been unusually angry today, and I do apologize for that. But hopefully, Naomi has a story that will take some of that away in our new regular feature, Grin, and share it.
Good news is welcome to me. Bad news is hell come to me. Good news. Do-de-o-do-lo, 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 I want good news.
What have you got for us today?
Well, Alex, you might be a cat man, but I am very much a dog person.
Cat man? That sounds like a Marvel superhero. I love
You'd be a great one.
I am a cat man.
And I couldn't resist sharing a story that demonstrates the close bond between humans and canines. Research now shows that dogs first became man's best friend 12,000 years ago. And that just as to this day, I cannot resist giving Wrigley the odd bit of crust from my morning toast, my forebears were similarly feeding doggos out of love and appreciation 12,000 years ago. Indigenous people in the Americas began forming these close bonds 2,000 years earlier than previously recorded on the continent, based on remains found in Alaska.
Was there a bowl with Fido on it?
Researchers have unearthed a tibia, a lower leg bone, of an adult canine at a long-standing archaeological site about 70 miles southeast of Fairbanks. And radiocarbon dating shows that the canine was alive about 12,000 years ago, near the end of the Ice Age. And chemical analysis of both bones found substantial contributions from salmon protein, meaning that the dog had regularly eaten fish. But the researchers said that wasn't typical of canines in the area at that time, and they only hunted land animals almost exclusively, and that the most likely explanation for salmon showing up in the animal's diet is because their human was giving them a little bit after they'd eaten.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Isn't it?
That's really wonderful. Archaeology is making all kinds of leaps at the moment.
Isn't it?
It really is. These new techniques and technologies are coming into it, and they're finding... They solved the mystery of the pyramid.
They did. Yeah, I did. I nearly went with that story.
I missed this. What happened?
Basically, between a mixture of satellite imaging and AI modeling, they found that there was an offshoot of the Nile that went all the way down that valley to where the pyramids are. So the mystery of how did they carry these massive stones
we now know.
For miles and miles and miles. They didn't. They travelled down barges because they've now found that there were tributaries that went all around that area.
They've also discovered a 6,500-year-old railway line near Stonehenge.
Oh.
Aye, right.
Yeah. This is the next.
I like that.
Yeah.
And a Joan Rivers joke carved into the wall of the cave. And that's the end of this week's Quiet Riot. Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. Massively enjoyed it.
You're so lovely to chat to.
We could listen to you all day. Thank you to everyone who has tuned in, and thank you to our backers who joined us at our Ask Our Anything call on Monday night. Apologies, we were a bit late, technical difficulties logging in, but it really was so wonderful to see all your gorgeous faces and field some sublime and ridiculous questions.
No, I think we'll do another Ask Us Anything because we had technical difficulties.
Okay.
It was so short. I really am advocating for an Ask Us Anything in early January.
All right, let's do an Ask Us Anything early January, but we will be overdue an editorial meeting, so we should do one of those.
Yeah, we can do one on my birthday.
So head over to ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod and sign up as a monthly backer.
But if you're spending every penny on Christmas presents for the family, have no fear. We understand. You can always support Quiet Riot in non-monetary ways. Our content will always be free to everyone, regardless of ability to pay. But you can push our posts on social media. You can leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever your favorite app is. You can share your favorite episode with a friend on WhatsApp to help grow our listenership.
We'll be back on Sunday School at the weekend. But for now, lots of love and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Andreou, and produced by Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Canelu, and edited by me, Alex Reese. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Sandstone Global.
Quiet Riot.
So, listeners, keep your ears peeled. Eyes peeled, ears open, ears peeled, eyes... I don't know.
Let's ask
you know
Arabella.
what I'm trying to say.
Oh, this is a nice end of show bit. I can see that making it into the blooper reel.
So keep your... What do you keep them? You don't keep them peeled. What is it? Keep your ears...
Open.
Is it?
You can't close them, though.
You haven't got ears like mine.
So keep your ears peeled. We're going with peeled. So keep your ears open for a Quiet Riot show with Arthur Snell coming soon.